Hello and welcome to the 13th edition of the GreenWave podcast by SYNI International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, affectionately known as the SDGs, and how they might shape our path to a net zero, sustainable future, despite the swirling political currents of 2025. Grab a comfy seat because we've got a lot to unpack, and I'm determined to keep it enlightening, a little cheeky, and most of all, relevant to the decisions we must make now. Let's start with a very quick history lesson. The SDGs were adopted in 2015, building on the earlier Millennium Development Goals, MDGs. The MDGs tackled poverty, hunger, and disease between 2000 and 2015, and they spurred real gains, though unevenly across regions. Encouraged by that partial success, the global community decided to be bolder, broader, and more inclusive, creating 17 SDGs with 169 targets. These goals address pretty much every social, economic, and environmental challenge we face, from ending extreme poverty to combating climate change to making sure our oceans and forests aren't reduced to relics in a museum. The SDGs aren't legally binding. There's no global sheriff to fine a country for missing them. But the hope was that moral commitment, peer pressure, and a sense of shared destiny would push governments, businesses, and communities to act. Over the past decade, many have indeed stepped up. National governments have embedded SDGs into policies. Cities have formed alliances to become greener and more livable. Corporations have used the goals to sharpen their sustainability strategies, and the public is far more aware that everything, people, planet, prosperity, connects. The 17 SDGs are vast, so here's the speed dating version. 1. No poverty. 2. Zero hunger. 3. Good health and well-being. 4. Quality education. 5. Gender equality. 6. Clean water and sanitation. 7. Affordable and clean energy. 8. Decent work and economic growth. 9. Industry, innovation and infrastructure. 10. Reduced inequalities. 11. Sustainable cities and communities. 12. Responsible consumption and production. 13. Climate action. 14. Life below water. 15. Life on land. 16. Peace, justice and strong institutions. And finally, 17 partnerships for the goals. For the record, even though SYNI International's business objectives are spread across SDGs 7, 8, 9, and 11, my personal favourite is SDG 14, Life Below Water. I'm a sucker for surfing, beaches, sea turtles, and coral reefs. If you've seen images of plastic-entangled wildlife or bleached corals, you know how crucial it is to protect our blue planet. Oceans cover most of Earth, regulate climate, feed billions, and provide more oxygen than all the forests combined. Yet we're still dumping millions of tons of plastic into them each year. SDG 14 aims to reverse this grim situation by cutting marine pollution and protecting at least 10% of coastal and marine areas. We've seen some progress, like more marine protected zones, World Surfing Reserve locations, and a new high seas treaty, but the gap between promises and practice remains huge. So, how are the SDGs doing overall, halfway to their 2030 finish line? Let's be candid. We're behind schedule. The COVID-19 pandemic blew holes in many achievements, pushing millions back into poverty, disrupting education, and straining healthcare systems. Then came inflation shocks, extreme weather, and geopolitical upheavals like Russia's war in Ukraine. The result? The UN warns that more than 80% of SDG targets are off track. Instead of forging ahead, we're struggling to recover lost ground. Still, bright spots exist. Global renewable energy capacity soared in the past decade with plummeting solar and wind costs. Gender equality has advanced in leadership roles and legal protections in many countries, though plenty remains undone. Some nations have significantly improved water access. And technology breakthroughs, such as mass-produced electric vehicles, are reshaping industries. The SDGs created a shared language. Everyone from teachers to CEOs can talk about Goal 13, climate action, or Goal 10, reduced inequalities, without rehashing definitions. That's progress, even if it sounds a bit esoteric. Now let's talk politics. It's 2025. We're in a new landscape. Different global powers see sustainable development in very different ways, and some major players are rethinking their climate commitments. Start with the United States. The Donald, aka President Trump, has severed all connection between the US and United Nations on climate policy. He's also left the Paris Agreement on climate. He campaigned on deregulation, more domestic fossil fuel production, and a rollback of Obama and Biden-era environmental standards. Almost immediately, several big banks, like JP Chase and Citigroup, pulled out of the UN-backed Net Zero Banking Alliance, apparently to avoid political attacks at home. Critics called it a major retreat from corporate climate pledges. Of course, many US states and cities remain committed to net zero pathways, but federal leadership has, well, let's be polite here, and just say, pivoted. The big question is, will America's shift stall global momentum on the SDGs, or will other actors, including some in the US private sector, carry the torch anyway? Turn our eyes to Europe. Traditionally, Europe champions environmental and social issues, from the EU's Green Deal to robust welfare states. But growing populist sentiments in countries like Italy, Sweden, and the Netherlands have led to a climate-skeptical edge in mainstream politics. Some leaders push back on new farming or emissions regulations, claiming they burden regular folks with high costs. Europe's climate targets, like cutting emissions 55% by 2030, remain on the books, supported by many in business and civil society. Yet, pushback from far-right or populist forces might slow the EU's ambitions. You can see that tension in heated debates over everything from pesticide reductions to electric vehicle mandates. The outcome will determine how forcefully Europe keeps driving the SDGs. Next up, China. It pledged to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2060, which, given its status as the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter, is a monumental promise. China is already a global powerhouse in solar, wind, and electric vehicles. Its green tech industries are booming. It's also building new coal plants at home to ensure energy security, so it's not exactly a squeaky clean climate hero. At the same time, China invests heavily in Africa, Asia, and beyond through the Belt and Road Initiative. Officially, Beijing says it's turning that into a green belt and road, but evidence is mixed. Some projects are indeed sustainable, while others lock developing nations into coal and other fossil infrastructure. As for the SDGs, China generally champions them in official statements. It's a major driver of poverty reduction and infrastructure development. But in practice, it balances sustainability with economic growth priorities. Whether China can genuinely pivot from coal to clean energy quickly enough remains one of the biggest questions for global net zero hopes. And then there's Africa. With over 1.4 billion people and a fast-growing youth population, it holds enormous potential for sustainable growth. If financing and governance challenges can be addressed, climate change hits the continent hard, from droughts in the Horn of Africa to cyclones in southern countries. African leaders have demanded more climate finance from richer nations, pointing out they contribute the least to global emissions, yet suffer disproportionately. Some countries, like Kenya, already get most of their electricity from renewables, and others, like South Africa, are trying to shift from coal to green energy with international support. Africa's progress on the SDGs is uneven. Advances in health, education, and infrastructure are real, but poverty, hunger, and conflict remain serious barriers. A coordinated approach, where wealthier nations actually keep their funding promises, would be a game changer for African countries, possibly accelerating progress on multiple goals at once. Whether that support materializes, however, remains a question. The upshot is a world in flux. Some governments double down on green transitions, while others pull back or waffle. And in the corporate world, we see parallel tensions. Sustainability is popular in annual reports and marketing campaigns, but the moment political controversy arises, major players sometimes backtrack, like with the Net Zero Banking Alliance departures. Critics call this greenwashing. Defenders say it's pragmatic adaptation. Either way, it illustrates that without stronger incentives or regulations, voluntary climate pledges can evaporate. That's worrisome for the entire SDG agenda, since many goals depend on partnerships, SDG 17, and robust financing. Which brings us to the money question. The annual financing gap for SDG-related investments, clean energy, healthcare, education, infrastructure, runs into trillions of dollars. The UN Secretary-General has urged developed countries and major financial institutions to pony up at least $500 billion a year in extra development financing for poorer nations, a figure that might make your head spin. Yet, in 2023, global military spending topped $2 trillion, putting our priorities in stark relief. Even with philanthropic contributions and green investment trends, we're falling short of what's needed to truly accelerate the SDGs. Debt burdens also hamstring many nations. If you're a country spending big chunks of your budget on interest payments, it's hard to invest in solar farms or universal healthcare. So, the push is on for overhauling global finance rules, from World Bank lending to IMF programs, to give developing countries a fairer shot. Of course, we shouldn't ignore the climate crisis itself. The 2000s have been an onslaught of extreme weather, record heat waves, wildfires that turned skies orange in big cities, and unprecedented floods. The drive for net zero by 2050 is essentially a race against time to avoid catastrophic warming beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius. SDG 13 specifically calls for urgent action to combat climate change, and it's arguably the pivot point for all other goals. Worsening climate impacts undermine agriculture, affecting SDG 2 on hunger, create health crises, SDG 3, and damage infrastructure, SDG 9. So even if some leaders blow hot and cold on climate, the planet itself is done waiting. The natural systems that sustain human civilization are under stress, from bleaching coral reefs to thawing permafrost. This pressure will keep building until we drastically reduce emissions. Will the SDGs remain relevant if we fail to meet many targets by 2030? Absolutely. Even if we blow past the 2030 deadline, the goals provide a comprehensive vision of what sustainable development looks like, integrating economic, social, and environmental dimensions. There's already talk in UN circles of extending or revising them for 2040 or 2050. But whether or not they're updated, the big idea stands. We need a roadmap for eliminating poverty, protecting the planet, and ensuring prosperity for all. That's not an overnight project. Reaching net zero alone may take until mid-century or beyond, and social inequalities won't magically vanish at the stroke of a certain year. That's why the SDGs, or something like them, will likely remain our guiding compass. Concretely, what can we do now? The UN's SDG stimulus plan proposes massive funding. Regional approaches are also emerging, like Africa's push for a new financial deal and green industrialization, or the European Green Deal's attempt to align growth with climate goals. We've seen public-private partnerships in renewable energy, agricultural innovation, and digital access. The same is true for philanthropic and impact investments, targeting everything from malaria vaccines to microloans. Cities and local governments often move faster than national bureaucracies, experimenting with zero-waste initiatives or e-mobility programs. And let's not forget the youth movements. Young activists worldwide are pressuring leaders to fulfill the climate and social promises embedded in the SDGs. They're taking governments to court, organising strikes, and forming networks that cross borders. That moral imperative, "You promised us a livable future," is forcing some politicians and businesses to at least pay lip service, if not enact bigger reforms. Now, I'm not here to sugarcoat the situation. The scale of our problems can feel overwhelming, but the SDGs give us something to aim for. They remind us that everything is interconnected. Tackling climate change also means investing in equitable education, healthcare, and decent jobs, because a healthy, skilled population is more resilient and better able to thrive in a carbon-free economy. Meanwhile, preserving oceans, SDG 14, isn't just about saving cute dolphins. It's about maintaining fisheries that feed communities, coral reefs that protect coastlines, and biodiversity that underpins entire ecosystems. Is it possible we see further backtracking from global banks, corporations, or governments? Very. Some might again cite political pressure or economic downturns to justify retreating from sustainability goals. But just as we saw with the Net Zero Banking Alliance fiasco, there's often a backlash from citizens, investors, and other stakeholders demanding consistency. In some instances, European and Asian banks reaffirmed their net zero commitments right as US banks were pulling out, effectively saying, "If they won't lead, we will." That kind of tension can ultimately drive the discussion forward, albeit in a messy fashion. We also must watch new technology trends, like artificial intelligence. AI might help optimize renewable grids or detect illegal fishing, strengthening SDGs 7 and 14. Yet it might also automate jobs out of existence if not managed properly, impacting SDG 8 on decent work, or create new inequalities, as SDG 10. In short, the future rarely arrives neatly wrapped. We also must ensure emerging tech is harnessed to support sustainable development, not just corporate profit. Looking ahead, I expect more talk about how to update or extend the SDGs beyond 2030. If we accept that big challenges, climate stabilization, deep inequality, biodiversity collapse, won't be fully solved by that date, we might adopt a second phase of global goals through 2050, aligning with the net zero timeline. That might include new objectives around digital governance, AI ethics, or climate adaptation, adding to our existing aims. But let's keep something clear. The original 17 goals are still valid. There's no reason to stop pushing for them. If anything, the more challenges intensify, the more we need a unifying plan. You might wonder, what's the bottom line? Are we cynically doomed to watch big players bicker and sabotage progress? Or is there genuine hope that the SDGs will continue guiding us toward a safer, fairer world? Realistically, it's a bit of both. We'll see steps backward, like certain banks or governments retreating, and steps forward, like unstoppable growth in renewables, local community action, and unstoppable youth advocacy. The climate crisis itself is making these questions unavoidable. Droughts, storms, and heat waves don't negotiate. They force responses. Whether those responses align with the SDGs or ignore them will define the world we inhabit for decades to come. Despite the uncertainties, the best strategy is to keep championing the SDGs as a blueprint for comprehensive solutions. They're about simultaneously tackling poverty, inequality, and environmental protection, and that synergy matters. It's no good addressing climate if we ignore social justice, and we can't properly handle social equity if we let climate disasters derail development. When you see the daily headlines about the Donald waffling on climate, or Europe wrestling with populism, or China building both solar farms and coal plants, or African nations calling for more funds, remember that these goals remain bigger than any single actor. The SDGs express global aspirations that transcend election cycles, national borders, or corporate profit margins. In an ideal world, we'd see a stable political environment championing them wholeheartedly. Progress will be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But as the late Kofi Annan once said, we must do more than just speak about the future. Let us build it. The next few years are crucial. We have until 2030 to salvage as much progress as possible, and then we may well set new milestones. Meanwhile, net zero emissions by mid-century is the overarching mission to save our climate. They're intertwined objectives. One can't work without the other. If we keep pushing, keep innovating, keep holding leaders accountable, the SDGs can remain the moral compass guiding us. Well, that's a wrap on our 13th GreenWave podcast episode. I appreciate you sharing your time with me today. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM, so feel free to follow and share with friends. If you missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette this week, no worries. You can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability. Stay inspired and keep advocating for a healthier planet, one SDG at a time.